Chapter 34 of Devotional Hours with the Bible, Volume 2, by J.R. Miller. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Mary Ann. Chapter 34, David and Absalom. Read 2 Samuel chapter 15, verses 1 to 12, and chapter 18, verses 24 to 33. The narrative of the rebellion of Absalom is one of the saddest stories in the Bible. The flight of David from his home, driven away by the rebellion of an ungrateful son, is most pathetic. The sin of Absalom stands in blackness almost next to the treason of Judas Iscariot. Absalom prepared him a chariot and horses and 50 men to run before him, and thus sought to make an impression upon the people and attract attention. The display he made was also intended to reflect upon his father's plainness. David was too old-fashioned. Absalom would show the people what real royalty was like. He was a dashing young prince. There are many young men, not princes of the blood, walking in the same way. They look upon their father's plain, quiet ways as entirely behind the age. The old man is too slow, does not know much about the world. Most people who study this lesson will think of someone who fills out the picture of Absalom. Probably it is yourself. If so, you must not fail to read the story to the end. These splendid horses and chariots generally drive to about the same place. Absalom rose early those days. Early rising is a good thing when one rises to begin a day of beautiful living and good to others. But when one rises early to do mischief and make trouble, to sow the seeds of sorrow, one would better stay in bed all day. Absalom rose early to do harm, to ply his art of treason, to poison the people's minds towards his father. Early rising for such purposes is not to be commended. "Thy matters are good and right," said the false-hearted prince, "but there is no man deputed of the king to hear thee." Sympathy is a good thing when it is sincere. One can do no sweeter Christian work than to go among those who are overburdened and those who are suffering, speaking cheering and strengthening words to them. To take by the hand someone who is down, one who has fallen in some misfortune, and to be a brother to him, helping him to rise, is a splendid thing to do. But such sympathizing as we see in Absalom is anything but Christ-like. He only pretended to be the people's friend that he might get their confidence, and then use them in his wicked plot to seize his father's throne. It was the flatterer's base art, not the friend's, that he used. "Oh, that I were made judge," he said, "that every man who hath any suit or cause might come unto me, and I would do him justice." He poisoned the minds of the people towards David by making them think that their king was neglectful, and that they were suffering wrong and injustice through his neglect. Then he suggested how different matters would be if he were judge in his father's place. Absalom cared nothing for the people's real or imaginary wrongs. He had no true sympathy with them. He was the worst kind of a demagogue. He thought only of destroying the people's confidence in David and winning them to himself. There are always people, alas, who think of no way of getting up but by pulling others down. It is easy for any of us, by careless words, even unintentionally, to disparage others by indirectly suggesting how much better we would perform these duties if they were ours. It requires a noble heart and most watchful care to be always loyal to others. So Absalom stole the hearts of the men of Israel. When we see a young man rising in the world, we have a right to know by what means he is rising before we can admire his success and approve of it. Is he getting up honestly or dishonestly? Is his prosperity fairly and legitimately won, or is it won by treachery, by deceit and falsehood? For such advancement as Absalom's is as a palace built on sand. Before any man follows Absalom's example, he would be better ask what became of Absalom's fine palace in the end. On this matter of stealing hearts we should linger also a little. To steal is to take something which is another's, to which we have no right. We have a right to make friends, but not to steal hearts. We steal a heart when we get a person to be our friend by influencing him against another person, and making him think we will be a better friend to him than the other. We have no right to interfere with the friendships of others to get people to love us. We need to guard against doing anything dishonorable to win friends. Absalom said unto the king, I pray thee, let me go and pay my vow. He stole the people's hearts and induced them to care for him more than his father. Then he stole the garb of heaven to hide his treachery. He must get away from Jerusalem to sound the signal of revolt, and the best way to get off would be on a religious errand. He easily fabricated such an errand. He said he had made a vow when he was in exile. Would his father permit him now to go and pay that vow? He knew this would please his father. David would think that Absalom was growing penitent, and that soon he would be a better man. There's nothing baser possible in this world than such a use of the name of religion. With Absalom went 200 men in their simplicity. Absalom had attached these men to himself, no doubt, by flatteries and favors. Now he invites them to go with him to Hebron, and to be present at the princely feast he would there give. It was a high honor. The men were complimented by the invitation. All Jerusalem would envy them. They had no thought of Absalom's real design, and yet, without intending it, they seemed to enter with him into the rebellion. This is an illustration of the way in which men will still try to lead others into evil. They cover up their real object, and under the profession of friendship draw the innocent and unsuspecting into their schemes. When the true nature of their design is disclosed, it is too late to withdraw. Compliments from bad men or women should be accepted charily, for ofttimes they have some evil design behind them. We ought never to allow ourselves to be led blindfolded into any wicked scheme. We need to be ever on our guard against designing persons, plausible flatterers, professing friendship, but insincere in their profession. The story of Absalom's plot is told in much detail. David seems to have been utterly unmanned when he was told of his son's treachery. He lost his courage. He arose at once and fled. There is none of the old-time heroism in his conduct. Each incident of the flight is described. All the country wept with a loud voice. The route of the fleeing king was over the Kedron, the same path over which, 1,000 years later, David's greater son passed on the night of his betrayal. The priests and the Levites came with the ark, but David bade them to return to Jerusalem. David went up by the ascent of the Mount of Olives, and wept as he went up, and he had his head covered, and went barefoot, and all the people that were with him covered every man his head, and they went up, weeping as they went up. The story of these terrible days is most pathetic. At length David reached Mahanaim over the Jordan, and preparation was made for resistance. The army was organized, and the day of battle came. David would have gone to the field, but his officers suffered him not to imperil his life. David was sitting between the two gates. Never did ruler watch more anxiously for news from a battlefield than David watched that day. It was not only his kingdom that was imperiled. The fact that the rebel leader was his own son terribly complicated the issue. Either defeat or victory would bring anguish to his heart. Children who go away in sin never know with what bitterness loving parents at home think of their evil courses. There are parents who pace the floor many long nights and look out at their windows into the streets, watching for the return of those who are dearer to them than their own life. If children knew how they crush the hearts of devoted fathers and mothers by going into sin, they would never choose such a life. All David could do that day was to sit between the gates and wait and watch. He could put forth no hand to save his son. He could only sit there in utter powerlessness and wait for the tragedy which would end the sad story. Years ago he might have prevented this terrible catastrophe, but now it was too late. At length a messenger came. The king said, "Is it well with the young man Absalom?" The king was lost in the father. David's interest in the safety of the country was swallowed up in his anxiety for the fate of his rebel son. He heard of the victory of his army, but that availed him nothing unless he knew that Absalom was safe. There is a story of a Lacedaemonian mother hearing of the coming of a messenger from the battlefield. The woman hastened out into the street to ask him what news he bore. With gentle words, so as not to add to her sorrow, the messenger said, "Your 5 sons are dead." With a look of withering scorn, she replied, crushing down in her heart her own personal grief, "I didn't ask you of the welfare of my sons. I asked if the country is safe." Patriotic feeling was stronger in her than parental love. In David, it was the reverse. Yet there were reasons in David's case for this difference. His son's name was dishonored, and, besides, David knew that Absalom's ruin was, in part at least, his work. This added to his bitterness. The one question that persisted that day on the king's lips was, "Is it well with the young man?" We may put other names in the place of Absalom's, and ask the question concerning young men we know, "Is it well with the young man?" It is never well with the young man if he is not living right, if he is not following Christ. There is a world of danger. Every young man must meet countless perils. Storms sweep the sea and the wrecks go down, bearing noble lives beneath the waves, and there is sorrow in the homes when the missing ones come not. The battle rages, and many a brave soldier falls to rise no more, and there is grief in the homes where the cruel blow strikes. But there are fiercer storms raging than those upon the sea. Our noblest young men are exposed to these. There are more terrific battles than those history records. Is it well with the young man? We mourn for those whom death claims. Should we not mourn for our living, when we remember to what perils they are exposed? They tried to have the news broken gently to the king. The first messenger, Ahimaaz, told the story so timidly that the king seems not to have grasped the worst. Then came the blunt Cushite, and told all with terrible plainness. The king was much moved, and went up to the chamber over the gate and wept. We see in this picture of the weeping king a glimpse of the Father's heart. Some might say that long before this David would have ceased to love a son such as Absalom had been, and would not have been so affected by his death. But no one who knows a parent's heart will say this. The intense love which had loved on through such a history of crime as had darkened Absalom's name is the same kind of love that all true fathers and mothers have for their children. It never unclasps its arms. It loves to the uttermost. David's love also gives us a glimpse of God's love for his children. Even their worst sins do not change his love. In David's grief over his lost child, we see how our Heavenly Father feels when we will not be saved. Christ weeping over Jerusalem shows this phase of divine experience. He wept because the people he loved and had come to save rejected him and his love, and refused his mercy. Would I had died for thee, O Absalom, my son, my son. No doubt David would gladly have died for Absalom, as he said, "In a burning mine, when there was no room for more in the car that was starting up on its last trip, one brave lad stepped off and gave his place to another lad, saying, 'He is not ready to die, and I am.' David would have taken Absalom's place for the same reason, but it was impossible. If David had lived for Absalom more faithfully when his son was younger, he might never have had this terrible sorrow to bear. The time for parents to show their love for their children most effectively is when they have them in their hands in tender youth, and not when they are dead. No doubt the bitterest element of David's grief was the thought that if he had lived differently himself, this might have never happened. There is a story of an old wrecker whose son had long been a wanderer on the sea. One night the father set his false lights on the coast, and a ship came ashore on the rocks. As the old man went along the beach gathering up the booty, he came upon the body of a sailor washed up by the waves. One glance told him it was his own long-lost son. It was his son's ship coming home that the wrecker had lured upon the rocks. His anguish was indescribable. Some such feeling must have been David's in his pathetic grief that day. In our sympathy with David in his grief, we must not lose the lessons from Absalom himself. He had splendid gifts and opportunities, but he threw them all away. He gave loose rein to his passions and was carried headlong into ruin. He was a type of what are called fast young men. We need only to study Absalom's story through to the end to see the outcome of all such lives. End of chapter 34, and end of Devotional Hours with the Bible, Volume 2, From the Crossing of the Red Sea to the Close of David's Life, by J.R. Miller.